We pick up our story today with Edna reminiscing about her first ski race 10 years before in March of 1938. We had been married almost a year. Max had taken a year's leave of absence from Penn State to teach skiing in the Sierras. We lived at Cold Springs, California, where Max taught. This year, I was to learn to ski. I remember learning the snowplow and the stem turn, but the parallel turn, or Christy as it was then called, was difficult to learn. One day I found a book which Max had brought along. It was by Charles Proctor, an already famous skier and instructor who was teaching over at Yosemite, not far away. Glancing through the book, I found a chapter on parallel skiing called The Pure Christy. I would quote from it here, but years later the book was lifted from the bookshelves at Ski Tip. Anyway, here was an idea for me to get used to the feel of how to do a Christy turn. Stand on a small rug, preferably a rag rug, placed on a well-waxed wooden floor, and then pretend one has just skied straight down a hill. Then suddenly push down the knees, push out the heels to one side, a sort of hockey stop. I enthusiastically tried this on our cabin floor by first polishing a spot just the size of a small throw rug we had, and then placing the rug over the spot. By running across the room and jumping on this rug, I could do just what the instructions said. Needless to say, I landed good and hard on my hip each time. I couldn't wait to try it on the snow. It worked beautifully, my hockey stop, until one day when the snow had softened from the warm sun and then frozen, so we had a smooth but icy slope. Without steel edges, it was like having my rug pulled out from under me. The icy snow was on a steep hill and not a flat floor, so that I kept sliding on my black and blue hips to the bottom of the hill. Okay, Max said, we'd better put steel edges on your skis. Then you'll have to learn to lean away from the hill on your turns. By the time March came along, I decided I'd like to try racing, since there was to be a slalom at this small Cold Springs area where Max was teaching. I looked down the course the morning of the race and assured myself, it looks easy. Ready, set, go. I flew down through the first gate. There were 5 gates in all. Made a turn, looked for the next gate. But there it was, above me. After finally reaching the finish, exhausted from climbing up to each missed gate, someone asked me, didn't Max tell you to turn before the gate? Max had been teaching 7 days a week, I answered. I'm like the shoemaker's daughter. No time to sew me any shoes. I felt like crying. What a fool I must have looked. Needless to say, I didn't finish very well, but I was hooked on racing for life. Max wouldn't let me quit. I'm going to show you how to run some gates. It's late March, and I've made enough money to get us through the summer, so I'll coach you this week. Next week, we'll go up to Mount Lassen, where they're holding the California State Championships, and you can race in that. I love that. I was ecstatic as we practiced hard for a week. We then left for Northern California, arriving at Mount Lassen area the night before the downhill. Early next morning, we were told to climb up past the jump, then follow through the woods on an old road, and we'd come to an open slope. Up on that open slope, we would see the start. We climbed as fast as we could. It was difficult climbing up the road as there was a big hump in the center. Trucks and other vehicles had driven there until the snow had gotten too deep. Tracks of the wheels had melted, making grooves on either side of the hump in the middle of the road. After reaching the open slope, we had to traverse back and forth as the start was quite a way up the mountain. The women were to go first. There were only two gates, the start and the finish. The finish is at the end of the road, the starter informed us as he waved a flag, hoping someone down there with a stopwatch could see him. Just stay on the road and you can't miss it. No one wore numbers then, nor had any of us heard of wearing helmets. I was terrified, knowing I'd have to shush straight down to that narrow opening in the woods. Max, sensing my alarm, came over to me as I stood in line waiting my turn. "Don't worry, honey. You know you like to shush. And remember, it's easy, Edna. It's downhill all the way." Which really wasn't the case, as I soon found out. I pushed off and headed straight for that opening in the trees, which indicated the road. What I hadn't noticed while climbing up was a sharp rise just before the road entered the woods. The speed I had wasn't enough to make this little uphill. I frantically herringboned up it and then proceeded down the road. The most terrifying part was still ahead of me. People were walking up to see the race. I shouted, "Track!" but they only laughed as they trudged uphill. Several even threw snowballs at me, or maybe at each other. I was busy trying to stay on the humped area in the middle of the road. I rounded a curve and saw, all of a sudden, a figure lying spread eagle in front of me, with a terrified expression on her face. She was the racer ahead of me. She had fallen and was too frozen with fear to get up. Yelling "track here" couldn't help any, so I was forced to weave around the trees and then get back on the road. Finally, I finished. At the end of that day at the lodge, I was thinking, Max was wrong when he said, "It's easy, Edna, it's downhill all the way." Did anyone, I asked, make that uphill part of the downhill without having to herringbone up it? Yup, you sure better bet. One guy made it. Someone laughed. "Who?" I asked. "Me. I raced that blasted downhill on my yumpin' skis, but yimmity, those yumpin' skis of mine can sure go fast." I looked up to see a 6'4" blonde Viking standing over by the fireplace. But I was puzzled. They mark your skis, so you have to use the same skis for the downhill and the slalom. How will you ever race the slalom on jumping skis? "Oh, I don't do slalom. I use jump." "You're Norwegian, aren't you?" I asked delightedly. "So am I." "You betcha. I'm Roy Mikkelsen from Oslo, Norway, and I've jumped at Holmenkollen. You born there?" "No," I answered regretfully, "but my parents were born there, and my maiden name was Strand. Maybe that's why I love to ski so much." The slalom was set the next morning on the golf course, with the start on the top of a bunker. I believed it was set there to accommodate the spectators better. "You still nervous?" The starter looked at me sympathetically. "Look here, take a swig of this brandy. Then you'll really relax and do fine." So I did, and a good hefty swig at that. I almost choked. After a moment, I began to feel a bit dizzy, but breathed in great gulps of the cool air. From the starting gate, I looked down at the almost flat slope. This'll be a snap, I thought. The next thing I knew, I had spun around the first gate. My ski pole had pulled off my mitten. I stood there hanging onto the slalom pole while I tried to reach down for my ski pole and mitten. And then I heard someone yell, "Hey, you're in a race. Get going." I am? I looked up. Well, I better ski down this thing. Gosh, I'm feeling dizzy. I did the splits and fell flat on my face right at the finish gate. Was Max ever embarrassed? "Never again will you ever take a drink of anything the day of a race," Max stated to me. He was really mad and disgusted with me. Oh, well, I laughed. It was a lot of fun. Soon we headed down the mountain to the already green, fertile valley of the vineyards and back to Sonora.